Welcome to She Persisted. I'm your host, Sadie Sutton, a 19-year-old from the Bay Area studying psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. She Persisted is the teen mental health podcast made for teenagers by a teen. In each episode, I'll bring you authentic, accessible, and relatable conversations about every aspect of mental wellness. You can expect evidence-based teen-approved resources, coping skills, including lots of DBT, insights, and education in each piece of content you consume. She Persisted offers you a safe space to feel validated and understood in your struggle, while encouraging you to take ownership of your journey and build your life worth living. So let's dive in. Hello, and welcome back to She Persisted. I'm so excited you're here today. This is one of my favorite episodes that I've recorded in a really long time. It is with one of my professors from Penn, Professor Ruscio. She taught my abnormal psychology class, and she is a practicing clinician. She works with adults, and she just brought so much interesting insight to the conversation about mental illness and mental health, and I learned so much during this semester course, which you've probably heard bits and pieces of in the podcast if you've been listening consistently. But this episode is a really powerful conversation about depression, about anxiety. We talk about the importance of skills education. We talk about subclinical depression. We talk about stress. We talk about common cognitive experiences in depression. We talk about comorbidity and so many things that I think most people aren't aware of when it comes to depression and anxiety, but really are very helpful to know if you are struggling or if you know someone that is struggling. So I'm so glad that Professor Ruscio joined me for this conversation, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Her links will be in the show notes today if you want to learn more about her research, but yeah, I'm so excited to bring you into the classroom with me and learn more about mental health and specifically depression and anxiety. So with that, let's dive in. Thank you so much for joining me today on She Persisted. I'm so excited to have you on the show.
It's such a pleasure to be here with you.
Of course. So I'm really excited for this conversation. We're going to kind of go a little bit all over, but we're centering a lot on anxiety and depression and what lays the foundation for mental illness, and really just kind of diving into those, not risk factors per se, but talking about what happens in childhood, what teens can do to reduce risks, and then talking about how similar some of these different distress disorders can be. So to start, I'd love to talk about why adolescence is such a critical period for depression. It's something that most people are somewhat aware of, that things develop before 18, 24, but there's not a ton of understanding as to why that is. So I would love to get your perspective there.
Oh, yeah, such a good question. And it's a question that mental health professionals have been pondering for a long time. So, for a long time, people thought that depression really didn't start until adulthood. And it's really been the last few decades that increasingly psychologists, psychiatrists have realized that, in fact, depression often begins sooner than that. We know that there is a really large increase in the rate of depression that happens during adolescence. So prior to about age 12 or 13, there are kids who get depressed, but they're relatively few. And most of those cases don't persist into adolescence and adulthood. But starting at around age 12 to 13, there's just a dramatic rise in the rate of depression. So you see an increase of about 3% of kids or so might become depressed at some point, but then the rates go up to about 17% by age 18, which is much more similar to the rates that we see in adults. So why that is a really important and interesting question. We don't have a great understanding. There are sort of some indicators from research studies as to what might be going on in the adolescent period that could be contributing to the increase. There is some thinking that this could be connected in part to biological factors, particularly those that are linked to puberty. And it does seem, for example, that kids who experience onset of puberty earlier are at increased risk for depression, particularly girls. So there may be something going on, almost certainly something going on related to hormones. In addition, it appears that there are increasing levels of stress, particularly uncontrollable stressors that occur in adolescence compared to childhood, and in particular, interpersonal stressors, especially for girls. So I don't know if we'll get into this more later, but there's a very long literature indicating that there is a sex difference in depression. Girls are about twice as likely as boys to develop depression at some point in their lives, and that sex difference emerges in adolescence. So something about stress, especially interpersonal stress, may be important in helping understand why it is that adolescents, much more so than younger kids, become depressed.
Yeah, it's also interesting because I think a lot of the times when adults experience periods of stress, it's just a period. They've navigated that before, they know they can get through it. Whereas in
Mm-hmm.
adolescence, when you experience academic stress or relationship stress or interpersonal stress, it's really for the first time. So you don't have that experience to be like, okay, I've coped through this before. It's going to be okay. I know how to navigate this. This won't last forever. It's like the first time you're navigating it, there's not a lot of guidance there. And so it feels subjectively like that much overwhelming, more
Yeah,
overwhelming.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. When we've gone through something many times before, we know we can weather that. We have coping strategies that have worked for us before. We have kind of the bigger perspective to put this particular situation into. We know we
Mm-hmm.
can lean on our supports to get through it.
Yeah.
But it's harder when you're experiencing these things for the first time, especially when you're an adolescent and you're still trying to figure out, who am I? How do I navigate the world? Who are the people in my world who I have trusting relationships with?
Yeah.
So that definitely makes it more challenging.
Yeah. Are there other factors that add to that gender gap in addition to girls having an onset of puberty more earlier on? There is kind of more social tension than there is with boys, but is there anything else that adds to that risk?
For sure, there are. Some of the factors that have been most studied are cognitive or sort of thinking related processes. So, girls are much more likely than boys to ruminate. This is sort of a style of coping with stress where girls are more likely to sort of sit and dwell on all the bad things that have happened. How is it? Why do I feel this way? Why do I always get into these patterns? Why did that go wrong? And the more that people sort of sit and stew in that sort of negative, past focused thinking about things that are abstract, things I can't do anything about anymore, the less productive that can be. So, generally speaking, girls are more likely to ruminate, boys are more likely to engage in more active problem solving types of coping. And
Mm-hmm.
it turns out that all of us, when we ruminate, feel worse. And all of us, when we engage in more active problem focused coping, tend to be sort of more successful. So,
Yeah.
I think it's important to recognize that these are thought styles that can be changed. An interesting sort of related line of research is that girls are more likely to co-ruminate, meaning they're more likely to get together with friends and dwell together on bad
Yeah.
things that have happened. And that's also a pattern that's associated with sort of maintaining negative emotions over time.
Mm-hmm.
So, one of the things that your listeners might think about is if they find themselves sort of sitting and stewing about bad things that have happened that they really can't do anything about anymore, thinking about, okay, what can I do that is constructive right now? Something active, something that will get me moving instead of
Mm-hmm.
sitting here and dwelling on bad things. And also, if they find themselves getting into conversations with friends where they're kind of feeling stuck, they're helping each other in a way stay stuck by going over and
Yeah.
over bad things again and again, thinking about how can we change this conversation to be more constructive, more future focused, more practical. What can
Mm-hmm.
we do in the situation? Or even like, let's stop talking about this for now and go and do something active and fun as a way of
Yeah.
breaking that negative thought cycle.
I love that. And it's definitely helpful because you can hold each other accountable. So it's not
Mm-hmm.
just you that's like, okay, I got to stop ruminating. But together you can be like, okay, what can we do? We're getting into this pattern again. Are there
Yes.
other best practices that people can implement to counteract these risk factors that are so common in teenage years, adolescence? I'm sure there's basic things like getting outside more, being engaged in relationships, but are there other recommendations that you like to give?
For sure. So I should say it's important to qualify this by saying that I work clinically with adults, not with
Mm-hmm.
adolescents. But a lot of the same strategies I think are helpful for adolescents as are helpful for young adults or older adults. So generally speaking, doing activities that are active are good. So exercise is always recommended as a way of improving mood as well as keeping you sort of healthy and fit. Doing activities that give you a sense of mastery and accomplishment are good. So these can be pleasurable activities, but they can also be things that aren't all that pleasurable, but that gives you a feeling of accomplishment. Like, okay, did the laundry, check, right?
Yes.
I ran this errand that had to be done, check, where you feel like, okay, I'm accomplishing things. So those are
Mm-hmm.
good too. But especially good are activities that give you a sense of pleasure, things that you really enjoy. That can be by yourself or with other people. It doesn't have to be a great big thing. It could be as simple as, okay, I'm going to go for a walk with a friend. I'm going to spend some fun time with a sibling.
Mm-hmm.
I really enjoy, reading this particular author. I'm going to go to the library and get a book I really enjoy reading.
Yeah.
All of those are good things.
It definitely makes me think of why a lot of teenagers experience like a shift in mental health when they go to college, because
Mm-hmm.
all of these things, whether it's building mastery or doing activities you enjoy, being active on a team, are really built into your schedule in high school. And then in
Yeah.
college, it's up to you to maintain those. So if you don't build those into your schedule, if you don't prioritize those, it makes sense why your mental health would struggle as a result.
I think that's absolutely right. All of us experience a change in routine when we go to college, right?
Yeah.
Your
Yeah.
routine is completely unended, and in addition, you're making your way with new relationships. The structure that's built into your life in terms of when you eat and when you sleep
Yeah.
and so on is changed, and a lot more is put on the student to place those structures in place, right, for them. There aren't parents there saying, okay, time to go to bed, right?
Yeah.
Or what did you eat for breakfast? You sort of have to do those things for yourself. And so
Yeah.
it requires establishing new routines and routines that are healthy and productive for you.
Yeah. One of the questions that I've gotten most frequently recently, which I hadn't had a lot of questions about before, was like high functioning or subsyndromal depression that
Mm-hmm.
isn't necessarily completely derailing activities or relationships, but it's definitely there. I would love to hear kind of what that clinical definition is, and then why it's still important to try and either get help, utilize resources, or at least attempt to problem solve, shift your behaviors and routines, even if it's not at the point where it's like, this is completely interfering with my quality of life.
Yeah, that's such an important question. So, we know that many more individuals experience subclinical levels of depression than those who experience clinical levels of depression.
Mm-hmm.
For some of those individuals, those symptoms escalate over time and can turn into a major depressive episode that might need clinical attention. All of us experience ups and downs. So it's important to recognize that having a few bad days doesn't necessarily mean you have a disorder or that this is
Yeah.
something even that's concerning. But it's good to be attuned to how your mood is and how your behavior is. And if you're finding that sort of day after day, you're feeling very low motivation to do things that are important or things that you usually enjoy, or your mood is really low consistently, then it's a really good idea to do something to attend to that. There are lots of things that can be done. One of the things that can be done is to seek help from a treatment professional, either psychotherapy or if you feel it's necessary and your provider recommends it, some kind of medication. But it's also possible to do other things that are less intensive, but that will be helpful to your mood. Some of those things can be as simple as some of the activities we talked about, but there are self-help books, there are app-based or internet-based interventions that are less intensive than doing, let's say, individual psychotherapy, but that can be quite helpful.
Yeah.
So looking into those resources can be good. And of course, talking with friends and family who
Yeah.
can be helpful to you as well.
I also love reminding listeners that the skills that are working for people that are like severely depressed, if those are working to lift that level of depression, there's a very high chance that those same skills are going to work if you're having an off day. So if there's
Absolutely.
one person that like physically cannot get out of bed and the skill that will work for them is doing the opposite of what they're feeling and lowering their physiological emotional intensity and asking for help and distracting from the emotion, those same things will likely work if you're like, I just cannot get to school today. I'm feeling so overwhelmed. I'm feeling unmotivated. Like those skills transfer, and you don't have to get to a certain level of distress to be like, okay, now we use the skills. Like if it's feeling
Mm-hmm.
uncomfortable, if it's bothering you, use the skills and it'll be easier to use them because the emotional intensity is lower than that like life interfering, life altering, super bad depression that some people experience.
I agree completely, Zadie. You're absolutely right. Those skills are useful because they're like good life skills,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So, like, not avoiding things that are making you uncomfortable or you're nervous is always a good skill. Like,
Mm-hmm.
staying active is a good skill. Examining thoughts that are unproductive and substituting more constructive, helpful thoughts, those are all great skills that can and should be used even when you're, let's say, more mildly distressed
Yeah.
compared to being clinically depressed.
I feel like that's one of the biggest ways that I've seen stigma show up is like that emotional thought block where people are like, well, it's not that bad, or I don't need those skills that people would learn in therapy. And it's like you're not even engaging in treatment, you're not even getting a diagnosis. Like, it's not close to what you think of stigma preventing people from doing. And yet there's still that emotional block of like, well, other people have it worse, or I don't need that help yet. And it's like, well, why not target it early? So like you said, it doesn't get worse over time and develop into severe major depression.
You're absolutely right. And these are skills I use all the time.
Yeah,
And it's
me
actually
too.
one of the best things I think about being trained in psychology is like you learn these great skills that are helpful for everybody. And I
Yes.
tell everyone I know about them, including healthy people.
Yes.
So these are
Yes.
they're just sort of good coping strategies that
Yeah.
all of us can benefit from. And you don't have to get to a certain level of severity to use them. And in fact, using those skills will help prevent you from getting to that point.
Yeah, I remember being in intensive treatment and being surrounded 24/7 by people that were like highly trained in DBT and using it in every single aspect of their life, both at home and in practice. There was therapists, there were the community, they weren't called community residents, but they were the like psychology students that were getting their hours in practice, and they would do daily activities with us. And then there was the educators, and then of course all the kids and teens themselves were using these skills. And I remember leaving and being like, why is everyone being so ineffective? Like, where is the dear man? Where is the emotion regulation? Like, guys, this could be so much easier.
I
And it
love it.
wasn't just like regulating anxiety and depression. It was just basic functioning and asking for help when you needed it and
That's right.
advocating for an objective. Like, these are all things that if you're functioning well, you're probably already doing. And if you're not, there's
Exactly.
skills to address it.
That's exactly right. I think these are often skills that people who are doing really well, high functioning, and achieving the important goals they've set for themselves, those are skills that they're doing intuitively.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right. Like interpersonal effectiveness, that's always something you want to do, right?
Yes.
Emotion regulation, that's always a good goal. Like
Mm-hmm.
use those skills. It's a gift to have that knowledge, and
Yeah.
using it on a regular basis can make you flourish even when you are sort of emotionally doing really well. It just strengthens everything.
Yeah, and then when you do have those low points, which everyone does, you know the skills. You know how to
That's
use
right.
them. They've worked before, and it's one less block to getting out of that low point because you are skilled and knowledgeable in how to navigate the challenge.
Exactly. And having practiced those skills again and again means
Yes.
that when you most need them, they'll be there for you.
I love that. This week's episode is brought to you by Teen Counseling. If you've heard of BetterHelp, Teen Counseling is their branch specifically for teenagers. So it's an online therapy program with over 14,000 licensed therapists within their network, and they offer support on things like depression, anxiety, relationships, trauma, and so much more. In this episode, Professor Ruscio and I talk about how effective treatment can be for both depression, anxiety, and other mental health issues. And one proven way to treat depression and treat anxiety is therapy and psychotherapy. And so a great way to get access to therapy is teen counseling. What you do is you go to teencounseling.com/shepersisted and you fill out a survey about what you're hoping to work on. So maybe it is depression, maybe it's anxiety, maybe it's relationships, trauma, whatever it is that you are hoping to work on, they match you with a therapist that fits your needs and fits that area of specialty. If you are under 18, you then put in a parent or guardian's email so they can provide consent to treatment and payment, but none of your information that you disclose in the survey is shared with your parents. HIPAA is enacted. So I tried it myself. All it says is Sadie or whatever your name is hoping to work with a therapist from Teen Counseling. Please click here to learn more and give consent. But teen counseling is a great way to start therapy or meet with a new therapist. It's talk, text, video counseling, all from your home and extremely accessible. So if you would like to try out teen counseling, you can go to teencounseling.com/shepersisted. Again, that is teencounseling.com/shepersisted. So another thing that I wanted to touch on related to depression, which I think is so interesting, which is again not something that is commonly known, is the relationship between stress and depression. So kind of stress generation and the kindling hypothesis, which if you don't know what those mean, we will explain, don't worry. But I would love to kind of hear your perspective there, because it's a really interesting school of thought that isn't always something that comes to mind when people are struggling, but it can be very helpful to be aware of if you are navigating depression.
Yeah, absolutely. So the basic principle of stress generation was introduced by Connie Hammond, a depression researcher. And what she discovered in her research is that many individuals who are depressed seemed to be engaging in behaviors that almost got in their own way, that were making things more difficult for them. And so these were events that, rather than sort of completely random acts like, I got, let's say, there's a hurricane, for example, that's something that I have no control over. I did nothing for this hurricane to happen. I'm unfortunately sort of stuck in the wrong place at the wrong time. That would be an independent stress, something's independent from me. But what she found was that many individuals with depression were engaging also in what she called, or experiencing what she called, dependent stress. So dependent stress, an example would be like frequent arguments with a boyfriend or girlfriend. Mm-hmm. This is something that I contribute to in some way, or potentially could contribute to. I might have a very quarrelsome boyfriend or girlfriend, but I also may be a person who is sort of repeatedly doing things that's causing arguments to happen or contributing in some way to the stress. Mm-hmm. This has been at first, at least, this was a controversial idea because we don't want to blame the victim. We don't want to say, like, people who are depressed are doing like bad things for themselves. On the other hand, I think it's really important to recognize when we are doing things that are making things harder for us so that we can take steps to try to improve the situation. Yeah. And so the basic idea behind stress generation is that, to some extent, all of us contribute or can contribute to the stress we experience. And the opposite side, or flip side of that, is that we all have the opportunity to reduce our stress levels by taking a hard look at what are we potentially doing that may be increasing stress for us. Mm-hmm. So I'll give you maybe a minor example. If I'm a person who's chronically late, I can't get myself on schedule. Yeah, I'm looking at myself too. Right. So, if I'm a person who's always late, then I'm going to be generating some stress for myself, right? I'm going to, let's say, pay a bill late. And as a result, I'm going to have a fine that I'm going to have to pay. Or let's say I'm going to arrive late to a meeting. And as a result, I'm going to be taken less seriously by the people I'm supposed to be meeting with, or I'll miss some important information. So maybe for students, like maybe because I'm oversleeping all the time, I'm missing class or late for class. And then I miss information I need to know in order to do well in exams. If I recognize that I am contributing to the stress that I'm experiencing by not managing my time well, then by improving my time management skills, I can actually reduce stress in my life. That's a non-interpersonal example, but an important thing to note is that Connie Hammond observed that most of the dependent stressors that she observed, especially in the women in her sample, were interpersonal in nature. So the women were engaging in behaviors that were increasing the likelihood of others in their life sort of arguing with them, leaving them, where relationships were more unstable or were ending, or just were more stressful, more, in their lives. So thinking very hard about what are the ways in which I may be contributing to difficult relationships. Mm-hmm. And that includes selecting people to have relationships with who may not treat us the way we deserve to be treated.
Yeah. I think that's a huge thing that, is very, very valid stress to experience. And with depression, a huge thing is having a support system and a group of people that can support you. And if your support system is doing the opposite of that, either like you initiating that or them initiating those conflicts, that can add to how difficult it is to come out of that depression, ask for help, utilize resources, and all of those things. In addition to kind of creating stress in different relationships, there are some like neurobiological, emotional, cognitive experiences that are pretty universal in people that experience depression. Mm-hmm. What are some of those that listeners can kind of listen for and kind of observe that might be happening? I think it's a great way to hear things that can be really validating, because depression can be so isolating. And yet, like you'll highlight in these universal things, it can be very relatable and, again, universal in the experience, even though it is so internal and feels so subjective.
Yeah, great question. So I can highlight a few of them. So one is kind of on a neurobiological level, what has been seen as often happening in depression is individuals who have a heightened sensitivity to stress and heightened reactivity to stress. So areas of the brain that are in sort of the limbic part of the brain, particularly the amygdala, are sort of heightened in individual with depression. So a tendency to experience negative emotion, to react very strongly to stress. And we see that prefrontal cortex areas of the brain that are involved in planning and in self-control, self-regulation are reduced. Activity in those areas are reduced.
And if you're a teen, those aren't even fully developed. So it's
That's
no
exactly
wonder that you're
right.
more susceptible.
That's exactly right. And in terms of the crosstalk between the limbic system and the prefrontal systems of the brain, there's sort of less tamping down of emotion by those frontal regions of the brain. And so people with depression, kind of a universal feature is the sort of heightened sensitivity and heightened reactivity when stressors occur. And all of us experience an increase in distress, an increase in sort of that cortisol response when we're stressed. That is normal. It's actually very adaptive. What seems to happen in depression is that people have trouble shutting that process off in a prompt
Yeah.
way. So, it's good that we react strongly when a stressor first occurs so we can marshal our resources and deal adaptively with that stressor. We don't want to ignore the stress, right? It's there for a reason to warn us that something's going on in the environment we need to deal with. But then once the stressor has resolved, we need to be able to bring our bodies back down and back to a regular stable state. And often individuals with depression have trouble coming back down in a timely way, and they're sort of more sensitive and more sort of hyper aroused for a period of time beyond what healthy individuals might experience. Mm-hmm. And maybe I'll talk about each of these universals, and then we can talk about it, what could be done about it. So Great. So cognitively, what we often see is people tending to respond in ways that heighten the stress by doing things like blaming the stressor on themselves and on stable things that can't be changed, as opposed to looking for outside reasons why the stressor might have happened, or recognizing that stressors come and go, that they can be temporary rather than a stable feature of me. So if I believe that when I encounter stressors, it's because something is inherently bad about me, it's unavoidable, and it's always going to be around, I'm going to be much more likely to stay depressed than if I recognize that stressors also are, can be things that are temporary, that are outside of me, and that can be controlled. Emotionally, we often see high levels of sadness and distress, but also low levels of positive emotion. So what seems to happen is that people are feeling sort of very sad, very hopeless. But in addition, they can feel just a really difficult time feeling pleasure and joy and connection to other people that really contributes to the difficulties of this disorder. And then interpersonally, oftentimes people withdraw from others. They isolate themselves rather than reaching out and connecting with other people. And that can make it very difficult for the depression to stop, in part because when we're alone, we're more likely to ruminate, and we're less likely to talk to people who can help distract us from what's going on, can help give us a new perspective that might be helpful and help us lift our mood. So all of these universals, I think, in terms of thinking about how to address them, an important first step is to recognize that, when stressors occur, all of us are going to react. What we have some control over is how are we going to respond? And so if we know that we're a person who, when we experience a stressor, tends to be, react really strongly, which is actually very common, not just among people with depression, then thinking about, okay, what can I do now to deal productively with this? So we talked earlier about active problem-solving types of coping. What about the situation is sort of out of my control, and it's like, I need to let go of that. And what part of this can I do something about? Let me actually make a plan for how I'm going to address this, taking kind of concrete steps and having a plan in place to address the things that can be addressed cognitively, emotionally, interpersonally, rather than kind of withdrawing and isolating myself and thinking about all the ways in which things are going wrong. Can I instead approach? So instead of avoid, I'm going to go approach. I'm going to reach out to people who I trust and who I love, who I know will help me get through the situation, give me something else to do, encourage me to try something different. Can I sort of think about activities that I can engage in that are going to lift my positive emotion and will help me curtail that negative emotional experience?
It's so interesting. I remember one of the biggest skills that I utilized initially in DBT was opposite action. And it
Mm-hmm.
sounds so counterintuitive because it's like you're going to do exactly the opposite of what your emotions are telling you to do. And
Mm-hmm.
it is on instinct that we listen to our emotions, that we lean into those urges because they're there to keep us alive. It's evolutionarily something that's very beneficial. And
Mm-hmm.
yet, when you have struggled with depression for a while and it's kind of skewing these emotional cues and it's not serving you to listen to them, you have to
Mm-hmm.
reteach yourself to not listen to them. And then at some
Mm-hmm.
point, you kind of go back to listening to your emotional cues as they get more balanced. But it can be very counterintuitive, especially initially.
That's exactly right. And I think, it's very natural that we want to avoid situations that give us pain, emotional
Yeah.
pain or physical pain. You're absolutely right that when you've been depressed for a long time, sometimes those emotions don't serve us very well. And we tend to want to avoid everything, including things that are potential sources
Mm-hmm.
of pleasure and accomplishment for us. And so doing the opposite sort of encourages us to approach rather than avoid in ways that can be very helpful.
Yeah, but you did touch on this a little bit. Avoidance is something that can show up a lot with anxiety, with OCD, with other mental illnesses. There is a pretty high level of comorbidity of depression with other mental disorders. What are your thoughts there? Is it something that like is it like depression is the first thing that causes these other things to pop up, or do these other stressors and overwhelming emotions then lead to this feeling of depression?
I think it's probably both. You're absolutely right that rates of comorbidity or co-occurrence of depression with other mental disorders is very high. In teens, very often the co-occurring conditions are other anxiety disorders. They can be eating disorders, substance use disorders. Sometimes depression is a response or a reaction to having those other conditions. So for example, if I'm really anxious, the depression may almost be like a demoralization reaction. It's,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I'm so tired of struggling so much. Life is really, really hard.
Yeah.
Other times, depression can actually contribute to these other disorders. So, for example, if I'm feeling really down and depressed, I might use substances to try to make me feel better, and that
Mm-hmm.
can lead to a substance use problem. And then, very often, there's some third factor that's contributing to both the depression and the other disorders. So, if I have a lot of stress, for example, that might increase depression as well as anxiety or substance use disorders. If
Mm-hmm.
I tend to engage in kind of problematic coping strategies that are causing problems for me, I may give rise to multiple disorders.
Yeah. Today's episode is brought to you by Sakara. Sakara is a nutrition company that focuses on overall wellness, starting with what you eat. They offer meal delivery services with plant-based, gluten-free, non-GMO, organic meals that are delivered straight to your door, ready to go. Some of them you can heat up, some of them you just pop in the fridge and they're good to go. This is a great solution if you have a very busy schedule and are running out the door without breakfast, or you're struggling to make a healthy lunch. Sakara is a great option and all their meals are delicious. They change their menu every week, so you can choose a menu with meals that you are excited about, and you can opt in for all 3 meals and snacks, or just breakfast or just lunch, so whatever you need. They also have an amazing line of wellness essentials and snacks. My 2 favorites are the granola. I love it with berries and yogurt, or their chlorophyll drops. They don't have a flavor, so it doesn't taste like you're adding greens powder to your water. You just get the benefits of chlorophyll and no weird taste. So those are my 2 favorites. You should definitely check them out. The link will be in today's show notes. And if you would like to get 20% off your first order, you can use code XOSADIE at checkout. Again, that is the code XOSADIE at checkout for 20% off your first order. The last thing I want to touch on, which I thought was so interesting, one of my favorite things we learned this semester, was about the idea of distress disorders and how similar generalized anxiety disorder and depression can be.
Mm-hmm.
Because if I were to think about it going in blind, it'd be like, well, they're completely opposite. Like, one is completely dampening your emotional expression and your mood, and the other one, it's like
Mm-hmm.
heightened arousal. And
Mm-hmm.
yet, as you explained, they can be so similar, and it's almost like how you're interacting with your environment and causal factors that can kind of create the difference of how you're presenting. So I'd love to hear your thoughts there about the similarities and the differences of generalized anxiety and depression.
Oh, yeah. So this is an area that I study and I find this so fascinating. So one of the things we talked about in class is that actually the genetic research suggests that genetically generalized anxiety disorder and major depression are the same disorder.
It's crazy.
It's so interesting. And when we look at the clinical features of these disorders, they do have a lot of features in common, right? So both disorders, for example, have involved difficulties with sleep, involve difficulties with concentration and decision making, involve difficulties with mood, especially high levels of negative mood, negative emotion. But there are some important differences too. In GAD, of course, we see heightened levels of worry and anxiety. And in depression, these are not central features, although we know that depression is very heterogeneous. And there are many individuals with depression who actually are quite anxious
Yeah.
and very, very restless, have difficulty falling asleep, and so on. It has a very kind of anxious, depressed, mixed presentation. Although worry has traditionally been thought of as a feature of anxiety, not depression, we now know that rumination in depression and worry in GAD are close cousins. They're not the same exact thing, but they are very, very similar. Both involve this process of thinking in an abstract, uncontrollable fashion about things that are bad about me and that I, for the most part, cannot change.
Yeah.
And worry is more future focused, rumination is more past focused. But other than that, there's not too many things that distinguish worry from rumination. So one of the possibilities my students and I have been actually studying is perhaps that tendency to get stuck in negative, repetitive patterns of thinking actually is a shared vulnerability factor for GAD and major depression. And there are the active treatments for depression and anxiety have a lot of shared features. Many of the same strategies are helpful in psychotherapy for GAD and major depression, and many of the same pharmacological treatments are effective for GAD and major depression. So there definitely seem to be a lot of commonalities there for us to think about. There are some differences between GAD and MDD, but they're hard to find. Anxiety disorders have been described in the literature as disorders where people are primarily concerned about threat. We're very sensitive to detecting potential threats in the environment. And I don't mean just threats like a spider, a snake,
Yeah.
like those sorts of threats, but threats where I perceive there is some potential for a negative outcome for me.
Mm-hmm.
In GAD, this tends to take the form of thinking about all the bad things that could happen to me in the future and why I think I'm not going to be able to cope with those bad things if they happen to me, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we have found some evidence that threat sensitivity is higher in GAD than in major depression. However, major depression tends to show higher threat sensitivity than people who have no psychopathology at all.
Yeah.
So it's more of a matter of degree than
It's like a
really a complete
spectrum.
difference. Exactly. And sort of conversely, for major depression, we've been pursuing the possibility that in depression, what distinguishes it from GAD and from other anxiety disorders is that low positive emotionality,
Mm-hmm.
that difficulty finding pleasure and joy in life and enjoying rewarding experiences when they happen.
Yeah.
And we have found some evidence that yes, reward sensitivity, reward responding is lower in depression than in GAD. But once again, people with GAD show lower reward responding than healthy individuals who have no psychopathology. So again, a matter of degree.
Mm-hmm. So interesting. And again, going in blind, you would not pick up on those things. Like, I think the
Mm-hmm.
way that we're aware of them as a society, they seem so different. And
Yeah.
yet, when you really do look at the presentations and when you look at the presentation in compared to a normal presenting person,
Mm-hmm.
they're very similar. And there's a
Yeah,
lot of things that overlap. And
that's
again,
right.
like even from the treatment perspective, things that are effective on both fronts, which is great if you are struggling with comorbid depression and anxiety.
I think that's right. And what we know about generalized anxiety and major depression is that they usually go together. It's
Yeah.
very hard, especially in clinical settings. It's very hard to find people who have one and not the other. They
Mm-hmm.
often go together. And individuals who have both generally have sort of the most emotional distress.
Mm-hmm.
They're most reactive to stress. And sometimes over time, they're the individuals who are going to be sort of more have a more chronic course of illness. And so those are
Yeah.
the individual we see as where it's especially important that they seek help and learn and use those strategies regularly to manage their emotions and to cope successfully with stress.
Yeah. If there is one piece of research or literature or a statistic that you wish the general population was more aware of relating to depression, anxiety, and mental health, what would it be? I know that's
Oh,
hard.
wow. That's a hard one. So I think that I don't know if this is a statistic per se. Maybe I'll give you two things if it's
Okay.
okay.
Yeah.
So one thing that we talked about in class this semester, and for me is sort of the most mind-blowing statistic about mental illness, is that most of us will develop a mental disorder at some time in our lives. So general population surveys in the US have shown that approximately half of the adult population in the US will have a mental disorder at some time in their life. That's probably an underestimate because that number, it comes from studies of people who are living out in the community. And we know that people who are, let's say, in institutions, for example, in prisons or in inpatient hospitals, or people who've died prematurely due to suicide or accidents, have an elevated rate of psychopathology relative to others in the population. And it's also the case that when we ask people, have you ever in your life experienced ... Sometimes people forget
There's so much stigma in our society. It's no wonder that people would underreport.
And that's the other thing, that people may be reluctant to report, especially since these surveys are usually done with lay interviewers who are strangers. And these are sensitive things to talk about, especially with some stranger who's come to your home, right? And so when people are followed forward in time, we actually see rates as high as 70 or even 80% of people will eventually develop a mental disorder. Wow. Now, that's really important and hopeful in a way, because it tells us that it need not be stigmatized to have a mental disorder. In fact, the more rare and unusual situation is the person who reaches, the age of 80 or 90 having never had a mental disorder. I think we have a lot to learn from those individuals.
Like, are you okay?
I know, exactly.
Are you interacting in the world at all?
Can you teach me? So there is more recognition of that and desire to learn from those individuals, but also to some extent normalizes at some point in our lives, we're going to go through a rough patch. It might be really rough. For some individuals, there will be recurrent problems or chronic problems. And for others, the problem will resolve and not recur. So I think it's just important to recognize that mental illness is all around us in one form or another, and that having experienced this, we're not alone. We're actually in the majority. So that's really important to note. And then I'll pair that with the second observation I want to share, which is that effective treatments exist. We have some really effective treatments out there. And the real heartbreak for me is that so many people who struggle and suffer don't know about these treatments or don't have access to these treatments. So I think if you're a person who is struggling with depression, with anxiety, because I know that's the focus of today's conversation, we have effective treatments. It's so important to get help because, those treatments can be extremely helpful. And given that these are problems that can persist and become chronic or recurrent over time, the earlier you seek help, the better, because learning those skills will help you not only deal with the current episode of depression, but prevent future episodes from happening in your life.
I love that. I think that's the perfect note to end on, and it's relevant to anyone and everyone, whether you yourself have struggled in the past, currently struggling, may struggle in the future, are trying to support someone who is struggling. It really is something that is universally important to know and be aware of. And it really just makes me wonder, again, how we have so much stigma when, again, the majority of us do struggle or will struggle at some point.
Yeah, I think that so often we don't talk about these things because we feel like we're alone, we feel ashamed. And I think if we open up the dialogue and are open with one another about this, we'll discover that, in fact, many other people are dealing with very similar things.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so glad we got to do this.
Me too. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been such a pleasure, Sadie.
Of course. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of She Persisted. If you enjoyed, make sure to share with a friend or family member. It really helps out the podcast. And if you haven't already, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also make sure to follow along at She Persisted Podcast on both Instagram and TikTok, and check out all the bonus resources, content, and information on my website, shepersistedpodcast.com. Thanks for supporting, keep persisting, and I'll see you next week.